November 23, 1975. The damp air over the river in central Angola clung heavily to the ground, thick with the scent of wet soil and unburned diesel. To anyone passing by, the rolling green hills around the small village of Ebo appeared tranquil, almost picturesque beneath the gray rain-soaked sky of the wet season. But along the narrow dirt road leading toward the wooden bridge, a steel giant crept forward. From the vantage point of Soviet advisors observing the operation from Luanda and other northern command posts, this advance was expected to be little more than a triumphant march. The People's Armed Forces for the Liberation of Angola, FAPLA, supported by experienced Cuban regulars and outfitted with some of the best equipment the Soviet Union could provide, were driving south. Their mission was straightforward: crush the anti-communist forces, regain control of rural territories, and cement Marxist dominance in the newly independent country. Spearheading the advance was an imposing armored column. At the front rumbled BTR-60 armored personnel carriers, and more significantly, Soviet-supplied T-34 and T-54 tanks. These were not the Red Army's most modern machines, but in the context of the African bush wars, they were colossal. Nothing in the region was believed capable of surviving a direct hit from their main guns. The intelligence briefings given to the Soviet advisors were confident, almost dismissive. They insisted the opposition, a patchwork alliance of FNLA and UNITA fighters, was poorly armed, demoralized, and retreating. According to Soviet doctrine, the plan was simple: apply overwhelming firepower. The column was expected to roll across the bridge at Ebo, scatter the disorganized rebels, and continue its advance without resistance. No reports mentioned hostile armor. No signs of Western intervention, only light infantry and transport vehicles supposedly stood in their way. As the column reached the bridge, the rain intensified, drumming loudly against the metal hulls of the lead vehicles. The Cuban officer at the front squinted through the downpour. The valley was eerily silent, broken only by the grinding of transmissions and the roar of engines. And then, without warning, the unimaginable occurred. It didn't begin with a thunderous explosion, but with sudden annihilation. The lead armored vehicle did not merely detonate, it came apart as if struck by an unseen hammer. A high-velocity round, moving faster than sound, smashed into its hull. Metal shattered and seemed almost to melt under the force. In an instant, the armored car became a burning carcass, blocking the narrow crossing. The entire column froze in shock. Inside the T-34s and T-54s behind it, crews scrambled to understand what had happened. Turrets jerked left and right as gunners scanned the dense vegetation. Where did that come from? No muzzle flash pierced the mist. No smoke trail revealed the firing point. Only the sudden, violent destruction of the lead vehicle. Contact front, radios barked in Spanish and Portuguese. Tank fire, heavy tank fire. Their judgment seemed logical. Only a main battle tank, a British Centurion or an American M48, could strike with that level of force. Soviet advisors monitoring the radio traffic back at headquarters felt a surge of dread. Heavy tanks? That makes no sense. The Americans had promised not to intervene. The South Africans were thought to be far to the south, and even then, they weren't believed to possess armor capable of such a blow. The column tried to maneuver, but the terrain betrayed them. The road sat atop raised ground bordered by deep, swampy marshes that could swallow a 40-ton tank whole. There was nowhere to go. A second shot blasted through the rain. This time a troop-laden BTR-60 erupted in flames. The hit was clean and deliberate. This was no wild barrage from frightened infantry. It was precise, measured, almost rhythmic, a sniper's methodical cadence. But this sniper was firing 90mm heat rounds. Panic rippled through the ranks. FAPLA infantry riding atop the tanks hurled themselves into the mud, spraying the jungle blindly with AK-47 fire. They were fighting an enemy they could not see. Back at the forward command post, Soviet officers stared at their maps in disbelief as frantic reports poured in. The column was not just pinned down, it was being taken apart piece by piece.
They say they are under attack from multiple directions, one advisor translated, his voice strained. They claim it's a squadron of tanks, possibly French, possibly American. A senior Soviet officer slammed his fist onto the table. Nonsense. The CIA is crippled by their Congress. They wouldn't dare deploy armor. And the South Africans? They're light infantry. Who is destroying our tanks? The confusion was not just a battlefield problem. It was a strategic disaster in the making. The Soviet Union had poured vast resources into Angola. It was the keystone of their plan to dominate South Africa and control the sea lanes around the Cape of Good Hope. They had invested millions in weapons, logistics, and personnel. They had assured the Cubans that their T-54s and T-55s were invulnerable to anything the rebels possessed. If this armored spearhead was destroyed, the political and psychological consequences would be enormous. It would imply that the West had escalated the conflict in secret, deploying advanced systems that Soviet intelligence had completely failed to detect. At the bridge, the destruction continued. Cuban tank commanders, disciplined and courageous, attempted to push the burning wrecks off the road to clear a path. As a T-54 surged forward to ram aside the debris, a projectile slammed squarely into the turret ring. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The turret, weighing several tons, was hurled into the air, spinning violently before crashing down into the sodden marsh like a discarded toy.
The radio channels crackled with frantic voices. "Missiles! They're firing guided missiles at us!" someone shouted. Another voice argued back. "No, this is artillery! Direct fire artillery!" The troops simply could not grasp what was happening. They expected a monster to reveal itself, a roaring, smoke-belching tank. They were searching for the unmistakable profile of an American M60 or a British chieftain, but they saw nothing at all. The rain grew heavier, sending blood and oil streaming toward the river. Whatever was attacking them seemed to be everywhere at once. Every time a Soviet-made engine roared, a shell struck it with surgical precision. It wasn't just that they were taking hits, it was that each strike found a vulnerable spot over and over again, as if the unknown enemy could see straight through their armor. By late afternoon, the pride of the Soviet-backed offensive had been reduced to wreckage. Dozens of vehicles were destroyed, and hundreds of soldiers lay dead or wounded across the kill zone. Yet not a single hostile tank had been confirmed. For the Soviet advisors, darkness only deepened the dread. Communication with the front line had collapsed. The unthinkable had happened. A technologically superior, numerically dominant armored force had been stopped cold by nothing. This wasn't merely a defeat, it violated every expectation of battlefield physics. If the West had developed a system capable of annihilating a tank column without revealing itself or deploying armor, the strategic balance of the Cold War might have shifted overnight. A desperate search for answers began immediately. The Kremlin demanded answers, Havana demanded answers, but as the rain continued to fall over the burning hulks at Ebo, the only response was the hiss of static and the chilling realization that they were fighting something they did not understand. The morning after the disaster at the Ebo Bridge, the atmosphere at the Soviet mission in Luanda was not simply grim, it was electric with fear. The war room, usually filled with confident discussion and ideological certainty, had become a frantic center of crisis management. Air conditioning units rattled loudly against the tropical heat, while sweat dripped from the uniforms of senior GRU officers and military attachés gathered around long conference tables. Spread before them were photographs. Not sharp satellite imagery, rain-season cloud cover made that impossible, but rough, grainy black and white reconnaissance shots. Cuban MiG-21 pilots had risked their lives, flying at treetop level under fire to capture these images. What the pictures showed seemed to break every rule of armored warfare. The approach to the bridge looked like a graveyard of Soviet industry. The mangled remains of T-34s and T-54s lay scattered like discarded toys. Some were overturned, others had burned so intensely that only skeletal frames of metal remained. But it was the pattern of destruction that confounded the analysts. "Look at the spacing," one colonel said, his finger trembling as he pointed. "The lead vehicle here, the second here, the rear guard here. They were hit sequentially, perfectly controlled fire. This wasn't panic. It was an execution." The survivors who managed to stagger back to friendly lines told stories that sounded unreal. Hardened Cuban veterans, men who had fought in the Sierra Maestra, were trained under the harsh regimens of the Eastern Bloc, spoke of phantoms. One tank commander, his head wrapped in bandages and his eyes empty, sat before interrogators and repeated the same phrase. "There was no sound. We heard the impact, then the explosion, but we never heard engines. Armored columns make noise. You can hear a Centurion or a Patton from kilometers away in dense jungle. Whatever fired on them made no sound at all." That detail sent a chill through Soviet intelligence officers. Silent, heavy armor was a technical impossibility. A tank required a massive diesel engine to move its 50 tons of steel. If the enemy vehicles were silent, they had to be far away. But if they were far away, how were they achieving direct hits through thick Angolan vegetation? The investigation quickly split into two competing theories, neither reassuring. The first, pushed by political officers, insisted the CIA had deployed a clandestine elite strike force. The argument was political, not military. The Americans were still reeling from Vietnam and wanted no public war. Therefore, Washington must have hired the most capable mercenaries in the world, French paratroopers, British SAS, or perhaps remnants of old colonial units, and armed them with cutting-edge anti-tank guided missiles. That, they argued, would explain the uncanny accuracy. ATGMs, like the French SS-11 or the American Tau, could certainly destroy tanks. But the forensic evidence contradicted this idea. The few fragments investigators recovered showed signs of kinetic penetrators, high-velocity solid projectiles, not the shaped charges used by missiles. Missiles leave narrow entry holes and a jet of molten copper. The wrecks at Ebo showed catastrophic shock damage characteristic of high-speed solid rounds. So they returned to the only remaining explanation, one that made no sense. Guns. Very large guns. "If it's a gun," the senior artillery advisor said, slamming a report onto the table, "then it's a tank, and if it's a tank capable of killing a T-54 head-on, we are dealing with an M60 or a Leopard. Where are they hiding them?" Paranoia began to seep into the Soviet command structure. Reconnaissance patrols were sent deeper into the bush, moving painfully slowly. Every rustle, every shifting shadow became a potential threat from this unseen superweapon. The fear spread rapidly through FOPLA and Cuban ranks, soon becoming known as the Ebo syndrome.
It became a kind of psychological epidemic. Soldiers refused to move forward unless preceded by overwhelming artillery bombardment. Tank crews, once confident in the strength of their Soviet-built armor, began welding scrap metal and piling sandbags onto their hulls. Desperate, useless measures against the weapon they still couldn't comprehend. The Soviets needed a breakthrough. They needed to capture one of these ghosts, or at least recover a body, to finally identify who they were fighting. About a week after the ambush, a reconnaissance unit trained in Spetsnaz doctrine managed to approach a skirmish line near the coast. They lay motionless in the mud for 12 straight hours, observing enemy movements through binoculars. What they reported only deepened the enigma. They did not see American soldiers. They did not see the French Foreign Legion. Instead, they observed white men who moved with the easy, practiced confidence of hunters. Their clothing was mismatched. Some wore shorts, many sported beards, but their discipline was flawless. Yet it was the vehicles that baffled the scouts. They described low-slung wheeled machines racing through the bush. They resemble armored cars, the report said. Small, 4 wheels, not tracked. The Soviet generals in Luanda dismissed the account with scorn. "Armored cars?" one general repeated with a bitter laugh. "You're suggesting our heavy tank column was destroyed by glorified jeeps?"
To them, the idea was absurd. An armored car carried only a machine gun or a light cannon. Such weapons would bounce harmlessly off a T-54's armor. "Stop wasting my time with fantasies," he ordered. "Find the tanks." This refusal to accept what was in front of them blinded the Soviet command. Their doctrine was rigid, rooted in the belief that warfare obeyed strict hierarchies of weight and firepower. Heavy armor defeated medium armor. Medium armor destroyed light armor. A lightweight wheeled vehicle overpowering a main battle tank? That contradicted every principle taught in the academies of Moscow. Because they rejected the possibility outright, the investigation spiraled into paranoia. Moscow began to suspect that the South African Defense Force had secretly rushed its entire armored division northward. "They must have brought centurions," one intelligence summary declared. "They are hiding them beneath dense canopy during the day and advancing at night. We are facing a full-scale armored invasion." This misinterpretation changed everything. Convinced they faced a massive conventional enemy, the Soviets ordered their Allied forces to entrench. Their advance halted. The initiative was lost. They demanded heavier air support and requested squadrons of MiG-21s to bomb the jungle blindly, hoping to hit these imagined tank battalions. They were bombing empty forest. Meanwhile, the ghosts were still out there, quietly watching Soviet confusion, listening to the panicked, unencrypted radio chatter, preparing for the next attack. The Soviets had built their defenses to fight a dragon, a slow-moving, heavily armored beast like themselves. They positioned artillery, fortified their lines, and waited for the rumble of heavy tracks. They had no idea that instead of a dragon, they were facing a pack of wolves. The investigation had completely collapsed. The Soviets knew they were losing men and machines. They understood they had been stopped, but they still had no idea how or by whom. A superpower convinced of its own technological superiority simply could not process the evidence. They were searching for a rival superweapon, a technological equal. What they were about to learn was that, in the African bush, the deadliest weapon was not the heaviest tank. It was the one that could move before the enemy had time to think. While the Soviet command in Luanda scrambled, arguing over satellite images, debating ballistic data, and drawing meaningless circles on maps, hundreds of kilometers to the south, a group of men were refueling their odd-looking wheeled vehicles from jerry cans, checking their breech blocks, and laughing about the Russian bears too frightened to advance. The truth of Ebo was about to reveal itself through the next engagement, not through spycraft. The Americans were not the ones pulling the trigger. The source of the destruction was something far more local, far more adaptable, and to the Soviet worldview, far more humiliating. While the generals in Luanda debated the existence of imaginary tank divisions, the reality sat quietly under a camouflage net near the Namibian border. The force terrifying the Soviets was not a billion-dollar American stealth system. It was not a space-age, precision-guided invention from Lockheed. It was something far stranger, and in many ways far more unsettling because of its sheer audacity. It was a column of vehicles that looked less like combat machines and more like oversized dune buggies. This was Task Force Zulu, assembled covertly during the chaos of Angola's independence struggle. This was not a conventional army unit. It was a patchwork formation that later historians struggled to classify. There were battle-hardened veterans of colonial conflicts, Portuguese commandos fleeing the new Marxist regime, and at its heart, young South African conscripts and professional soldiers operating under absolute secrecy. Leading them were men like Colonel Jan Breitenbach, a legendary special operations commander who understood a fundamental truth. The rules of European warfare did not apply in the African bush. He recognized that Soviet doctrine, bulky, slow, predictable, was vulnerable, but he lacked the heavy armor to exploit that weakness. The West, crippled by political caution, refused to send main battle tanks. The CIA, operating quietly out of Kinshasa, provided money and fuel but could not risk supplying M60s capable of matching Soviet T-54s toe-to-toe. And so the South Africans turned to a uniquely African solution, a weapon born of necessity and shaped by the terrain of the Veld. To the untrained eye, the vehicle that obliterated the Soviet column looked almost absurd. It was the Eland 90. Based on the French Panhard AML, the Eland was tiny. It weighed just 6 tons, less than the turret of a T-54 tank. It rode on 4 large run-flat tires, giving it an awkward, top-heavy appearance that earned the mocking nickname the Noddy Car, after a children's book character who drove a toy taxi. It had almost no armor. The steel shell was only about 10 millimeters thick. It could stop rifle fire, but a heavy machine gun, standard on all Soviet tanks, would slice through it effortlessly. A direct hit from a tank gun wouldn't merely destroy it, it would obliterate it. But the Eland possessed 2 qualities the Soviet behemoths lacked: blistering speed and a punch wildly disproportionate to its size. Mounted on this tiny chassis was a formidable 90-millimeter low-pressure cannon, a brilliant engineering contradiction. How do you mount a tank-killing gun on something barely larger than a Jeep? The answer was the heat round, high-explosive anti-tank. Unlike Soviet kinetic shells that relied on sheer velocity to break through armor, the Eland's ammunition used chemistry. On impact, a shaped explosive charge created a superheated jet of molten metal that could burn through roughly 300 millimeters of solid steel. It didn't matter how thick the frontal armor of a T-54 was. If the Eland scored a hit, the molten copper would punch through the hull, flood the interior, and set off the ammunition. The men of Task Force Zulu understood exactly what they were doing. They sat inside fragile tin cans, hunting heavy Soviet armor. If they were spotted, they were dead.
The life expectancy of an Eland 90 in open terrain against a T-54 was measured in seconds, so its operators reinvented the very concept of armored warfare. While Soviet crews were trained for broad, sweeping offensives across the plains of Europe, South African crews trained for something entirely different: the snapshot kill. They didn't treat the Eland like a tank at all. They treated it like a sniper rifle mounted on wheels. Their strategy was brutally simple and unbelievably dangerous: fire and disappear. The Eland crews used their small profile to creep through the elephant grass with engines whispering at low RPMs. They treated the thick African bush, terrain that would trap a 40-ton tank, as their roadway. They waited silently in the shadows until the Soviet column unknowingly exposed its flank. Then they struck. A single shot, the 90-millimeter gun snapping like a whip, sent the lightweight vehicle lurching back on its suspension. Even before the round reached its target, the driver was already throwing the Eland into reverse. By the time the Soviet turret began to rotate toward the muzzle blast, the Noddy Car was gone, swallowed again by the vegetation, only to reappear 200 meters to the side for another shot. It was a doctrine built on raw aggression. The crews, often barely in their 20s, carried themselves with a kind of wild confidence that masked their calculated professionalism. They wore shorts, beards, and leather veldschoen instead of regulation boots. They lived off ration packs and slept beneath their vehicles. They were everything the rigid, regulation-bound Soviet conscript was not. And while the men were South African and the vehicles were French in origin, the strategic backbone of the operation came from American intelligence. In a covert operations center known as the Flea Market, CIA liaisons worked urgently to keep Task Force Zulu one step ahead. They provided the satellite data the South Africans lacked, tracked Cuban transport ships docking in Luanda, and monitored Soviet radio traffic, forwarding decoded intercepts directly to the Eland crews in the field. The Americans quickly grasped what the Soviets failed to see. The war in Angola would not be decided by who had more tanks, but who could maneuver faster. CIA handlers were astonished as field reports came back describing engagements where 4 or 5 Elands had taken on entire battalion-sized formations and prevailed. It reinforced a growing view within the Pentagon: quality and initiative could defeat mass and rigidity.
The Soviet system treated soldiers as replaceable parts. Lose a tank, send another. But the Western model, demonstrated here by conscripts and mercenaries, relied on independent judgment. An eland commander didn't wait for orders. He saw an opportunity, weighed the risk, and took the shot. As Soviet confusion deepened, Task Force Zulu pressed the advantage. They weren't merely defending, they were hunting. They knew the Soviets were frozen by fear. Intercepts confirmed the enemy firmly believed they were being stalked by NATO heavy armor. The South Africans found this hilarious. They also knew a terrible truth. If the Soviets ever realized they were being held back by lightly armored scout cars, the retaliation would be overwhelming. A simple mass rush would crush the elands instantly. But the illusion held. Colonel Breitenbach and his officers examined their maps. At Ebo, the Soviet forces were regrouping. They were bringing in BM-21 Grad launchers, the dreaded Stalin organs. They were preparing to obliterate the entire area. The eland crews checked their ammunition. Supplies were low. Their fuel was nearly gone. They were outnumbered 20-1, but they held the psychological high ground. They had become the monsters lurking in the mist. Everything was ready for the moment of revelation. The Soviets were preparing another push, convinced they were ready to face the phantom tanks. Task Force Zulu was preparing to prove them wrong and to tear apart the myth of Soviet armored superiority in Africa forever. Engines rumbled as the elands melted into the fog of the kill zone, waiting to meet the giants once more. By December 1975, the rain had eased, leaving the air thick and steamy. The Soviet-Cuban advance resumed, though with far more caution. The ghosts of Ebo still haunted them. The column moved toward another key crossing, Bridge 14. The Soviet advisors had changed their approach. No more marching in narrow columns. They now deployed T-54s and T-55s in a broad front, pushing through the elephant grass with barrels pointed outward, searching for the American heavy armor they still believed was lurking nearby. Behind them, truck-mounted BM-21 rocket launchers stood ready, prepared to blanket the horizon with explosives at the first sign of contact. The tension was suffocating. Every tank commander scanned through his periscope, watching for the silhouette of a 60-ton main battle tank. They expected something massive. What emerged instead was tiny. For the first time, a Cuban tank commander saw his tormentor. Less than 100 meters away, an Eland 90 burst from behind a termite mound. The mental shock was immediate. This was the enemy? A four-wheeled vehicle that looked more suited for a golf course than a war zone? Compared to the 36-ton Soviet tank, it looked absurd. But the gnat struck first. The eland commander didn't hesitate. At point-blank range, the 90mm gun fired. Its report was a quick, violent crack, nothing like the deep boom of a tank cannon. The heat round crossed the distance instantly, smashing into the T-55 just beneath the main gun mantlet. The shaped charge detonated, and the molten jet sliced through the thick cast steel like soft clay. Inside, the ammunition erupted. A catastrophic kill. The hatch blew open and fire poured out. The radios erupted with panic, not reports of tanks or mystery weapons, but of armored cars. Armored cars! We are being attacked by armored cars! The Soviet advisors froze. The message was checked and rechecked. Armored cars. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They had halted their offensive. They had summoned strategic air support. They had warned Moscow of NATO intervention, all because of a handful of fast-moving reconnaissance vehicles. Humiliation swept through the command staff, quickly turning to fury. They had been deceived. Crush them, came the order. Run them over. Soviet tactics swung from caution to brute force aggression. The T-55s gunned their engines, billowing diesel smoke as they charged forward. They abandoned the patience of the hunt and resorted to raw mass. If they could catch the elands, they would annihilate them.
If a T-55 managed to land even a single high-explosive round anywhere near an eland, the shockwave alone could kill the entire crew. What followed was one of the strangest armored confrontations of the entire Cold War, a chaotic, high-speed brawl in the tall grass. The Soviet tanks possessed tremendous firepower, but they were sluggish and nearly blind. Their turrets turned slowly, the hydraulics whining as they tried in vain to track the darting silhouettes ahead of them. The gunners, trained for long-range battles on the open plains of Europe, struggled to keep their sights on the erratic, bouncing elands. Realizing their concealment was gone, the South Africans pushed their vehicles to full throttle. They began circling the Soviet armor in a deadly, swirling dance. Eland drivers slid through mud, shifting gears furiously. Bang! Another T-55 was struck in the engine block, grinding to a dead stop. Bang! A BTR-60 went up in flames, its thin armor no match for a heat round. The Soviet reaction became increasingly desperate. They fired their main guns, wildly blowing apart trees, bushes, and termite mounds in the hope that a lucky blast would catch one of the evasive cars. MiG-21s screamed overhead, dropping bombs and strafing the tree line. But from 3,000 feet, the pilots couldn't distinguish the tiny armored cars from ordinary brush. The elands were too small, too well camouflaged, and lacked the heat signature of a real tank engine. The bombs landed harmlessly in the swamp. Shock turned into catastrophe. The Soviets' supposed technological superiority, heavy armor, air power, massive artillery, was rendered useless by the terrain and the adaptability of their enemy. When the smoke drifted around Bridge 14, the scene was almost unbelievable. The invincible Soviet column lay shattered. Burning T-55s littered the mud, destroyed by vehicles that, in theory, shouldn't have been able to damage them at all. Cuban prisoners who were captured afterward stared in disbelief as they were marched past the Eland 90s. Some touched the thin hulls with their knuckles, astonished by how flimsy they were. They realized their own heavy machine guns could have ripped through this armor. They realized that had they stood firm and simply fired their coaxial guns, they would have won. But they hadn't. Fear, confusion, and the mystery surrounding the enemy had beaten them before the first shot was even fired. Back in Luanda, Soviet advisors submitted their final reports. The panic was gone, replaced with resignation. The mystery weapon wasn't some American technological marvel. It wasn't a revolutionary railgun or physics-bending device. It was a failure of imagination. They had equated power with size. They believed dominance came from mass. They had forgotten the most ancient lesson of war. A weapon is only as formidable as the person using it. The impossible victory had been achieved not by a superweapon, but by a handful of fighters in flimsy toy cars who refused to fight on Soviet terms. The ghost was finally revealed, and it was made of thin metal and audacity. As the smoke drifted away from the riverbanks and crossroads of southern Angola, the full magnitude of the disaster became visible. Soviet advisors walked among the wreckage and were forced to confront the numbers. They were devastating. In just a few weeks of combat, the myth of unstoppable Soviet armor had been dismantled piece by piece. The reports from the battles at Bridge 14 and along the Ebo approaches were staggering. Reports indicated that dozens of Soviet-supplied T-34s and T-54s had been destroyed or captured. Hundreds of trucks, armored personnel carriers, and supply vehicles lay ruined. Cuba's expeditionary force, the proxy army Moscow relied on to dominate the region, had suffered thousands of casualties. And the price paid by the ghosts? Only a small number of Elan 90s were lost. Most of those weren't destroyed by enemy fire but by mechanical breakdowns or by sinking into the treacherous mud. The human losses for Task Force Zulu remained in the single digits during the decisive armored battles. It was an exchange rate of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Soviet hardware for the cost of a few light armored cars and the fuel to keep them running. But the Kremlin's deepest humiliation wasn't financial. It was ballistic. Forensic analysis of destroyed T-54s showed that many had been hit from the sides or rear. This proved that the heavy tanks, with slow-turning turrets and poor situational awareness, had been outmaneuvered. They weren't just outshot, they were outplayed. A superpower had been defeated by the improvisation of a so-called Third World force.
The disaster in Angola was far more than a tactical setback. It revealed a deep, systemic sickness inside the Soviet military-industrial system. The mystery of Ebo exposed the core weakness of Soviet doctrine, its dependence on rigid structure and overwhelming mass instead of agility, creativity, and independent thinking. The Soviet war machine had been engineered for the vast European plains. It was designed to refight World War II against NATO. The T-55s were built to surge forward in gigantic formations, trading blows and crushing opposition with sheer volume. Their officers were trained to obey orders from above, without deviation. A Soviet tank commander did not innovate. He followed the plan exactly as written. But in the African bush, that plan disintegrated instantly. The mercenaries and South African conscripts of Task Force Zulu operated under an entirely different mindset: mission command. A 20-year-old corporal driving an Eland 90 had the authority to make life-or-death decisions on the spot. If he saw an opportunity, he exploited it. If the situation changed, he adapted on his own. While Soviet advisors waited for authorization from Luanda or even Moscow to adjust their formation, the Eland crews had already maneuvered around them, fired multiple shots, and disappeared into the grass. The battle revealed the widening innovation gap that would eventually help bring down the Soviet Union. When confronted with a problem, the Soviet instinct was to add more weight, more steel, more armor, more concrete. The West and its regional allies were beginning to solve problems with speed, intelligence, and precision. The Eland 90 embodied this shift. On paper, it was fragile, outdated, and inferior. In reality, it was the perfect weapon for that environment. The T-54 was a relic, powerful but clumsy and hopelessly slow in the evolving landscape of modern mobile warfare. The consequences of this defeat rippled all the way back to the Politburo. Angola had been expected to deliver a swift, symbolic victory, a showcase for the unstoppable advance of global communism. Instead, it became a draining wound. Unable to admit that their heavy armor had been bested by lightly equipped forces, the Soviets doubled down. They sent newer tanks, more MiG-21s, and eventually MiG-23s. Thousands more advisors followed. They poured billions of rubles into propping up a conflict they had effectively lost in its opening phase. This was the brilliance, intentional or not, of the Western approach. By employing inexpensive, highly mobile asymmetric forces like Task Force Zulu, they forced the Soviet Union to spend fortunes attempting to swat a gnat with a sledgehammer. Every ruble spent shipping a heavy tank to Angola was a ruble not spent on the failing Soviet economy. The mystery that once terrified the advisors had become a devastating economic trap. Today, if you travel into the remote Angolan highlands, the jungle has reclaimed most of the battlefield. The trenches have long collapsed, and old artillery craters have become stagnant ponds. But if you search carefully, beneath vines and elephant grass, the remnants remain. Resting T-54s and T-55s still lie where they were destroyed in 1975. Their turrets sit blown off and overturned in the mud like the skulls of fallen giants. They stand as monuments to a moment when the world braced for a clash of superpowers, only to witness something entirely different. The Soviet advisors who stood in the rain, trembling before a phantom enemy, went to their graves knowing the truth. They were not stopped by an American secret weapon.
They were not defeated by NATO's strength. They were beaten by a handful of men in thin-skinned cars who understood that in the shadows, victory goes not to the largest beast, but to the one that strikes first and refuses to let go. The ghost in the bush had never been supernatural.